interpersonal emotions, the things we feel inside us, are a basis for communication. The part of our being that we call feeling is the part which allows us to express ourselves, to give to others. People communicate their feelings not only with highly descriptive sounds, but with spontaneous movements of their bodies and faces. We understand these expressions because feeling is one language common to all men. People also communicate their feelings and emotions through the visual arts. An artist shares his feelings and attitudes with us. He translates his inner experiences into visual form. There are as many ways of expressing feelings in art as there are artists. There may be as many responses to a work of art as there are viewers. We bring to art our own emotions and imagination in response to what we see. Our own fantasies and personal point of view may alter the mood established around us and within us. Man has always created works of art that reveal a variety of feelings in a variety of materials. A work of art is always contemporary. It reflects life. It stimulates change. The creative person responds to the mood of his society and expresses that feeling in art. Today, the expression of individuality and feeling is one of the primary concerns of an artist. How can the inward experience of feeling be translated into visual form? The expression of feelings in the visual arts depends to some extent on the medium the artist selects, as well as his skill in manipulating those materials.
I stain them.
The first thing you want to do is establish some idea,
It's like an extension of my hand. I don't have to worry about, you're not even aware there's anything in your hand. And that's what's really nice, because then you can start working.
I work with manila rope because of the basically masculine feel to it.
Well, I think the material is easy to handle. I've never had any trouble with it, and it always seems pretty successful for me. I mean, much more so than etching or dry point.
I prefer the transparencies and the buildup of layers of paint.
Of how they're going to go about it, because that's you just cannot go in for 10 minutes and say, well, we're going to start painting, and these are materials and these are techniques. That's how it goes. I think you ought to, go in.
Each medium has special characteristics which influence the artist and affect his statement. The elements of art also have distinctive qualities which can represent an individual's feelings. Line, texture, shape, color, light and dark. In themselves are vehicles for visual expression of emotions. Another important way in which people express their feelings in art is to imaginatively distort or abstract their subjects. Man and his environment continue to serve as inspiration for unique abstractions. Some artists record the dramatic movements of life. They are careful observers and interpreters of those human actions which expose emotions.
Piñata, con piñata. Die Wasser! Jetzt sind es 90.000, 107.000.
Ja, in diesen Jahren wirklich eine praktische Prinz.
Tant de combats, de fureur, de douleur, venu de sang. Żołnierze, lotnicy, marynarze polacy.
Moscow sind an allen scheinbar unmöglich.
United States of America, this is an emergency, as serious as war itself.
Sail on, full ship and stuff.
Great arsenal of democracy.
Deliberately attacked.
Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on my feet.
To find himself and his place in the universe, man turns to nature. From the essence of life itself, people can rediscover and express the feelings deep within them. Feelings are not tangible, but they may be expressed in tangible ways. The personal feelings of one man about his own world have been the basis for countless artistic statements, some timeless and universal in their meaning, others momentary and vague. Art, people, and feeling are inseparable. They are part of our basic experiences and existence. They are all of life.
at the present time, not a vestige of evidence that any of the characteristics that sociobiologists or indeed human evolutionists in general talk about have any genetic basis. We know nothing about why some people are more aggressive than others, some people are more entrepreneurial, indeed why some people have more musical ability than others. There is no evidence at all that such individuals differ in their genes. They may be entirely the result of their early experiences, of developmental accidents in the formation of their nervous systems, of the different societies in which they live, with no genetic differences being involved at all.
A human cell that is about to divide. Slowly, the genetic material is drawn into long threads. If individuals do differ in their genes, then these differences will exist here on the chromosomes. Each thread-like chromosome carries thousands of genes. Not one gene has been conclusively shown to influence any single feature of normal human social behavior. Yet Professor Wilson doesn't doubt the correctness of his view, even though it may be prone to a common misconception.
It's a common misconception about the inheritance of behavior, especially social behavior, that there has to be one gene, one basic unit of heredity for each behavior. This would be the extreme form of genetic determinism. That is, say, a gene somewhere down there in the chromosomes that causes aggression, another gene that causes altruistic behavior, and so on. It isn't that simple. What really occurs, or a closer statement of what occurs, would be that there are many genes affecting each one of these major categories of behavior, and that, in fact, they are not, as a rule, programming that behavior so that whenever you get a certain set of genes, you always get that behavior. What they program, really, is an array of potentials.
This idea of potentials is based on the zoologist's observations of animals in their natural habitat, and a view of animal behavior that there is a range of behaviors specific to a particular species. In this family group of North American marmots, the male on the left is playing his part as a good parent. This potential is in his genes. Yet in a neighboring colony filmed at the same time of the year, the males, many of them fathers, are not being such good parents. Instead, they are furiously interacting with each other. The sociobiological view is that this too is a potential in their genes, but is only called upon in circumstances of overpopulation. Then it seems an individual marmot is better off, or his genes are, by reducing another male's chances of success than by being a good parent. The genes provide the potential for either behavior, so giving the animal a built-in flexibility, a range of potentials. This gives the individual animal the choice of responding to its environment in the most advantageous way. But this has been criticized because it almost makes it impossible for an explanation of this kind to ever fail. What's more, the critics say these observations are deeply embedded in the all-too-common tendency to see animal behavior in human terms.
One of the problems that sociobiologists clearly have not thought about is that the very words they use to describe animal behavior are derived from human behavior and human social experience metaphorically. What does it mean to talk about aggression in an animal? They have begun to talk about aggression as if it were a phenomenon of lower animals, but in fact aggression is something we get out of human history. Aggression has an historical and political meaning.
Our ideas about aggression, about war, are indeed based upon history, possibly even personal experience. But what about the individual soldier's experience of war? Couldn't this be where the sociobiologist will find aggression in the individual in a biological sense? Or could this also lead to confusion in our attempt to understand war, which is, after all, a conflict between nations rather than individuals?
People talk about aggression in many different ways and slip back and forth between them, although they're very different things. For example, people are always trying to explain why there are wars. And they try to do that by saying, oh, well, there are wars because people are naturally aggressive. What they're doing is confusing the political phenomenon war with the individual phenomenon of my taking a poke at you if you insult me. The fact of the matter is, as any of you who's been in a war knows, you don't go to war, you don't go and fight other people because you feel aggressive toward them. You go either because of ideology, or because you were drafted and you had to go, and you've been thrown in jail if you didn't, or because social pressure has been such that you've done what you had to do, or for economic reasons and so on. Wars are economic, social, and political phenomena which really have nothing to do with the meaning of aggression in an individual sense.
Nevertheless, there is in these individual conscripts the capacity to cooperate, conform, and perhaps make a sacrifice. This has to be mobilized for the benefit of the nation at war. For the sociobiologist, our genes predispose us for this. The alternative view is that training, culture, and learning alone create the possibility. Anthropologist Marvin Harris.
See, what people fail to realize is that culture is as real as the genes. In talking about human culture and the processes by which human culture changes through time, we're talking about physical phenomena. We're not talking about some abstract, spiritualized concept. We're talking about something very concrete, a mode by which organisms transmit the behavioral adaptations which they have made on one generation across to succeeding generations. And this mode of transmission of learned behavior is as important in the universe as the beginning of life.
Because they are learned, the features of culture that are transmitted across the generations are not fixed. They can change dramatically. These New Guinea tribesmen have seen changes in their style of life that couldn't possibly occur through changes in gene frequencies that would take many generations. In the last 25 years, such tribesmen have driven their first tractor and mastered the skill of flying an aeroplane. They have acquired and practiced totally new medical skills, and from a background of isolated village life have created a parliament. If processes like this have gone on for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, the social life of human beings must have a history in which the impact of our genes will long ago have been replaced, or at least greatly modified by culture. The sociobiologists, however, seem undeflected in their confidence in their biological approach.
Biologists are aware that although there is an enormous diversity among human groups that is culturally determined, but nevertheless this doesn't expand infinitely. These human societies are not evolving away from one another like stars in an expanding universe. There are general, universal or near universal qualities of human behavior which need explanation.
The problem, nevertheless, for sociobiology is to probe beneath the surface of a culture and to reveal the biology. Only a few human societies have experimented with their social lives so as to make this a possibility. The Israeli kibbutz is one and has revealed a startling feature of human social life. Here at Kfar HaHoresh, several hundred people live a collective life based mainly on farming. As on most other kibbutzim, the children are raised by the collective rather than within their own families. This group of 7-year-olds have lived together from 6 months of age in the care of children's nurses and teachers. Each peer group, that is, children of a particular age, lives in its own house where they spend most of their time together, learning, eating, taking showers, and sleeping. The feeling within one of the children's houses is of the intimacy of family life. The children, though unrelated, are like brothers and sisters, and in a very deep sense, this has an influence on them that lasts into their adult lives. In particular, it will influence their choice of a marriage partner. For, strange as it may seem, It has been known for many years that children brought up together like this are found never to intermarry, despite the fact that they will have every opportunity and every encouragement. In this particular ceremony, as in many kibbutzim marriages, a young person from the kibbutz has chosen to marry someone from outside the kibbutz altogether.
בשלום עטרת בלה, גם בשמחה ובצלה, תוך אמוני ים סגולה, בואי חלה, בואי חלה. כי היום ניתנת לכם ההזדמנות לבנות בית בישראל.
The groom was born and raised on the kibbutz. The bride is from outside, a nearby town. She will now have to accept the collective ideology which is part and parcel of living on a kibbutz. But in return, her membership of the kibbutz will make her the social and economic equal of everyone else.
זהו, יד ימין, בבקשה, לעבור הטבעת. איפה הטבעת? אצלך או אצלי? שווה פרוטה? לא הקלה, הטבעת. ההקלה שווה הרבה מאוד. בבקשה, אתה תיקח את זה, אתה שמאלי או ימני? שמאלי, קח.
A marriage of some kind or other is a universal feature of human communities, and the various rules governing who can or cannot marry whom have long been of interest to anthropologists. In particular, every human society has a set of rules that involve a taboo on incest, the avoidance of marriage between mother and son, father and daughter, and of particular interest to sociobiologists, between brother and sister. Generally, anthropologists have considered these rules as part of human culture, because the way in which they are expressed seems to vary from culture to culture. Only man, the rule-making animal, has created rules of this kind, so that here, in the institution of marriage, it is believed that we can see what distinguishes man from other animals. If you like, it distinguishes creatures of culture from creatures of nature.
שלא ישלם את זה, אבל זה מס ערך מוסף גם כן. הכל יהיה בסדר.
Now, the fact that no one brought up in a kibbutz has ever married a member of the same peer group because he or she feels they cannot, even when there is no prohibition, means that we cannot maintain so rigid a distinction between what is natural and what is cultural. It is as if the members of a kibbutz who have been brought up together are in fact brothers and sisters and have a natural inhibition to avoid incest. It is in this apparent avoidance of incest that sociobiologists see the possibility of an explanation at the level of our genes.
The sociobiological explanation notes that incest avoidance is a very widespread phenomenon throughout the animal kingdom, where it serves in large part the function, the ultimate function, of avoiding intensive inbreeding, which in turn brings together genes which in combination cause defects.
And what is fascinating is that part of this seems to be solved in the human case by the simple avoidance of even sexual attraction to a person with whom you have been living in what amounts to a family relationship.
It has been suggested then that the children of a peer group will later avoid marrying one another because of their family-like upbringing. Between the ages of 3 and 6, they are learning to have a special kind of relationship with one another, that of brothers and sisters with whom it is advantageous to later avoid in marriage. Sociobiologists would suggest that the capacity to learn in this way and hence restrict our choice of future mates is laid down in our genes, because it offered in the earlier evolutionary history of the human family the great advantage of avoiding genetic inbreeding. But these children in the bath together are not brother and sister. In fact, they're not even related. On the kibbutz, the genes have been fooled. Now, if these children were to be raised separately on the kibbutz, especially between the crucial ages of 3 and 6, there would be no development of this predisposition. This biological insight, in effect, presents the kibbutz with a choice rather than a limitation. These insights are merely the work of Professor Joseph Schaefer. 30 years ago, he was a tractor driver. Now he is professor of anthropology at the University of Haifa. He believes that it is very important to remember that a new biological understanding need not limit us, nor need it simply suggest that what is biological is necessarily right. And he sees this from the point of view of someone whose own community has itself achieved a dramatic transformation in his own lifetime.
If I recall where my friends in this kibbutz came from, capitalistic, individualistic, competitive Central Europe, where everybody of us has been educated to be as individualistic and as competitive as he could. And we wanted to be professionals and we wanted to be merchants, and here we ended. We are collective farmers, and even those, the religious ones among us, became agnostic. And this tremendous change has been caused by a powerful ideology. But even so, a powerful ideology could only for a while change so basic a system in the human animal.
Not only is the kibbutz experiment about child rearing, but it is also about the relationship between the sexes. The founders of the kibbutzim wanted to break down the sexual division of labor in the human family. Women were to be freed of the domestic chores that tied them to the house. This would allow them to go off to work and by their work become independent of men. But what do we find in the present-day kibbutz? In the collective laundry, it is the women who do the work that they would otherwise have done at home. And generally the same applies in the kitchen and clothing stores. The kibbutz has recently been described as a place in which men and women seem to live as if in two separate communities. Now, this may seem a harsh view, but there is, without doubt, a division of labor within the kibbutzim on a sexual basis. Now, since the kibbutzim are communities that have so successfully achieved their other ideals of creating collective farms and sharing equally their labor and income, why should they fail in this one respect? For males don't just do the farming jobs, which are often physically hard, they also are more likely to take up managerial and political posts. Do their genes predispose them to do these things? And are there genes which influence women in some other way? Or is it the case, as many people would like to believe, that men and women are interchangeable, but for the influence of coercive customs and prejudices? The kibbutz, an experiment on a scale that no social scientist could ever have devised, may provide an answer. At the moment, there is still such a state of flux in response to both internal and external pressures that a conclusive answer would be premature. But the women have had to work alongside the men in some jobs. The rules of the kibbutz prescribe that. Yet women have felt the need to be more with their children, and they have fought and won the right to do so. Each morning, mothers may leave their work so that they can join their children in their houses for what is sardonically called the hour of love. Despite the equality of work opportunity, women have preferred to return to a family role, while men have not shown this need. As a further step, women also wish to bring to an end the completely separate sleeping arrangements of their children. It's as though they feel that the social system of the kibbutz has moved too far, or perhaps too quickly, from the basic family structure of the human species, and are taking steps to correct it. And who, at the end of the hour-long visit, can deny the potency of basic human motivations as Mum goes back to work?
The influence and the impact of even so a powerful ideology is limited to a certain extent. We could implement a tremendous revolution in different spheres of life, but in this sphere we were not so successful. And that means that man can change, can modify his own fate, but not without any limits.
But the limits experienced by the people of the kibbutz have been political and social as well as biological. And we have to ask whether sociobiologists have blurred this distinction in their desire to provide universal explanations. Consider the apple as a product of an evolutionary process. If we wish to understand why it has a waxy skin, then it is to evolutionary biology, to the theory of natural selection, that we can look for an answer. But as why the apple is also a symbol for original sin, that is a social fact, part of culture and history. Since so much of us is controlled by this cultural information, can any biological principle derived from animals that have no such information ever provide a useful human life? In fact, the necessity to distinguish social from biological truth is a warning sounded by the of sociobiology. Professor Lewontin.
When it is asserted that biological truth tells us some political truth. Over and over again when that's happened, we have seen the consequences. We have seen the way in which assertions about the biological nature of man and the causes of differences between men are the justification for a series of political and social acts, when in fact a closer examination shows that it is a misuse and a kind of pseudo-scientific application to social and political questions.
We began by considering the social achievements of ants. Here, a colony of honeypot ants is in a territorial conflict with a neighboring colony. None of these creatures can really choose to solve their conflict in any other way. Ants aren't political, nor do they create codes of behavior. But unlike ants, we are free to choose, and we are political and ethical animals as a consequence. Nevertheless, Professor Wilson reduces even these features of our humanity to a biological basis.
Ethical philosophers have a way of starting with certain premises which they take as self-evident or given, and then consider whether or not these are valid by the consequences that they have. They say, for example, there are certain inalienable individual human rights. There are certain duties which a citizen has toward his society. There are certain relationships among societies which are permissible and others which are not permissible. These are given out of the almost deep unconscious feelings of the philosopher, who is not able to divine his own physiological processes any more than the average layman considering the same problems. Now, what a biological explanation or mode of analysis promises to do is, if to the extent it's successful, is to explain the ethical philosopher, to show by evolutionary analysis why ethical philosophers, like everybody else, have certain gut feelings about what is right and what is wrong in human social relationships.
Suppose human evolution could begin all over again without any influence from existing societies. According to sociobiology, it would repeat itself almost exactly. It is a belief that our genes prescribe the ground rules of our lives, and that our future lies in our knowledge of them.
How many minutes to boil an egg? How many seconds left to play in the game? Hours, minutes, and seconds. These are 3 units of time, or intervals of time, we use every day. They are standard units of time, but we didn't always have them. Thousands of years ago, primitive man noticed daytime and nighttime. These were probably the first intervals of time that man observed. Gradually, early man noticed that the sun helped him divide the day into smaller intervals. Morning, when the sun was rising. Midday, when the sun was high overhead. And afternoon, when the sun was setting. Primitive man did not know that it was the turning earth that determined these intervals. But he did observe that an object in sunlight casts a shadow, and he noticed that the shadow moved over a period of time. Could man use a moving shadow to measure smaller units of time? Shadow clocks, or sundials, were among man's first clocks. Numbers were placed on the sundial to mark the changing positions of the shadows. Here the shadow is at the number 2. After a while, it is moved to the next number. This interval is 1 hour. Daylight was divided into 12 such intervals, 12 hours. 12 was, and is, a useful number. It is, for example, divisible by 2, by 3, by 4, by 6. But sundials had certain drawbacks. They could only indicate time when the sun was shining. How could man measure intervals of time when the sun was not shining? An early clock that did not depend on sunlight was the water clock. The small bowl had a hole in the bottom. The water seeped in slowly. A fixed interval of time could be measured from the moment the bowl began to fill to the moment when it sank. Just as a uniform flow of water could be used to measure an interval, the uniform flow of sand could also be used in an hourglass to measure an interval. It took about the same amount of time each time for all of the sand to pass from the top funnel to the lower one. Units of time could also be measured with various candles and lamps. This is one type of candle clock. Each light and dark band marks an equal interval of time. As the candle gradually burned, time was measured by the number of bands that were used up. Much more accurate measurements of time could be made with a candle clock which cast a shadow on a dial. As the candle burned down, the shadow slowly changed position. Hours and even parts of hours could be read on the scale. In the burning oil clock, oil was put in a flask on which intervals of hours were marked. When the lamp was lighted, the oil was gradually used up. The changing level indicated the hours. One disadvantage of most of the early clocks was that they could only measure a few hours of time at most. They then had to be reset. This problem was overcome by the introduction of gears in timepieces. Gears, important to all later developments in measuring time, made it possible to change a fast movement to a slower one. By using the proper combination of gears, the hand of a clock, and there was only one hand, could be made to turn at a desired speed for many hours without resetting. By the 14th century, clocks with gears were driven by falling weights hung on a chain. As the chain was pulled down, it turned gears which operated an escape wheel. The escape wheel controlled the turning of the hand. but not with sufficient accuracy. In the 16th century, Galileo, the astronomer, made an important contribution to the accurate measurement of time. He observed the principle of the pendulum. Each swing of the pendulum takes the same amount of time. This pendulum is attached to a balance lever that regulates the escape wheel. As the pendulum swings back and forth, the balance lever momentarily stops the escape wheel. In this way, the turning speed of the escape wheel is regulated. The regular and dependable rhythm of the pendulum made possible pendulum clocks. These were accurate enough to measure much smaller intervals of time. So a hand was added to show these smaller intervals. Minutes, 60 minutes per hour. The power source for a watch is a coiled spring, the mainspring. The mainspring made possible the first watches. This watch, called the Nuremberg egg, dates from about 1500. Although it had a mainspring, it had no accurate regulator. An accurate regulator for a watch is a small vibrating spring. It is called a hairspring and has a regular rhythm. This rhythm, like the rhythm of a pendulum, regulates the turning of the watch's escape wheel. It was the invention of the hairspring that made possible the more accurate measurement of the second, 60 seconds per minute. Like the number 12, 60 is also useful in measuring time, for it too can be divided evenly by several numbers. In the 20th century, electric clocks came into common use, providing even greater accuracy than spring-driven timepieces. This electric clock has no springs or pendulum. It is powered by electricity and is also regulated by electricity. The alternating current used has a definite number of cycles per second. This alternating current acts as a very accurate regulator in the clock. Several gears in the clock reduce the high speed of the motor to the slower motion required to turn the hands. In an electric watch, instead of a mainspring, a tiny battery is used. It supplies enough power to run the watch a year or more. With watches, we can measure intervals not only of seconds, but with certain watches, we can measure intervals of split seconds. This timer measures seconds in intervals of tenths of a second. Such intervals are based on the decimal system. In science, other devices are used to measure much smaller intervals in the decimal system. The oscilloscope can be used to measure hundredths of a second and even smaller intervals. A thousandth of a second is called a millisecond. A millionth of a second is a microsecond, and a billionth of a second, a nanosecond. To meet our present needs for measuring even smaller intervals, new time measuring methods and instruments have been developed. In this atomic clock, the vibrations of atoms make it possible to measure intervals even smaller than 1/billionth of a second. The story of measuring time is the story of man's learning to measure intervals of time in standard units with greater and greater accuracy. Hours, minutes, seconds, and even thousandths, millionths, and billionths of a second. Measuring intervals of time accurately is one of the important skills of measurement, a skill that we use especially in the worlds of science and mathematics.
physics, more than any other science, has changed our lives in this century. Now, as the century concludes, the physicists are attempting things few of us can even imagine. Changing substance into energy, mapping the tiniest structures of matter, communicating with intelligent life in the universe, stretching and slowing even time itself, traveling among the planets in ships to be propelled by hydrogen bombs, and searching through the fathomless depths of space for something called the black hole, into which everything could disappear, never to be seen again. Plasma, the mysterious stuff of lightning balls and sparks. To man, frightening and dangerous, an alien thing. Yet plasma is the essence of the universe. The stars, the matter between stars, the clouds of dust and gas in the arms of the galaxies, all are plasma, matter in which every single atom is exploded.
So practically everything we see is in fact plasma. In fact, I suppose there are only two places where you have large concentrations of matter which are not in the form of plasma. One is on planets like the Earth, and the other is in neutron stars.
As we step outward past the moon into space, we will encounter conditions that only a few men alive today understand. They are the physicists, prophets of a different reality that we will have to know in the century to come. Andromeda, a light with 100 billion stars, a galaxy much like the one we live in. Most of the billion galaxies in the known universe rush away from us, but Andromeda does not. Physicists have discovered that Andromeda is joined to the Milky Way by gravity, somehow reaching across a gulf of space so vast that light takes 2 million years to cross it. Albert Einstein theorized that gravity is not a force at all, but a curving of space caused by the pressure of matter, just as a mattress curves when you sit on it. Until the 70s, physicists could do little to test Einstein's theory of gravitation. Now, with new tools, they are able to search the universe for the strange things he predicted. One of the strangest is the black hole. At the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, Professor Freeman Dyson.
The black hole is an object which has become so condensed that it has, so to speak, fallen through its own gravitational field and collapsed to a point where it can no longer be seen from the outside world. So it is literally a black hole, just a place in space where everything disappears, where nothing can be seen. All that you can tell from the outside is that there is a mass there because it has a very strong gravitational field. And it would be lovely to discover one of these things. As far as we know, we haven't yet seen one. But of course, it may be some of these mysterious objects that have been discovered are in fact black holes, which we don't yet recognize. It's quite clear that Einstein's theory predicts they ought to exist.
The very idea of the black hole defies the imagination. A place where there is nothing but gravity. The star which caused the gravity is crushed into nothingness, but the gravity remains, sucking in and obliterating anything that comes too close.
Once the matter has gone down the spout, it's gone. But even that is not completely sure, because we don't yet know from a theoretical point of view. If you were allowed, for example, to collide two black holes together, nobody knows what the effect of this would be, whether some of the matter that had fallen down would be regurgitated. That's one of the questions theoreticians argue about, but we don't yet understand.
As astronomers search for a huge black hole in space, nuclear physicists search for a tiniest particle, a quark, out of which everything on Earth may be made. It has not been found, but some wonder privately whether the quark might really be a miniature black hole.
The astronomers have now been doing far better than the particle physicists. Whether this will go on, of course, I don't know, but it looks likely it will go on for quite a while. We are just starting to open up a whole lot of new channels, new windows through which we're looking out at the universe with various kinds of infrared, ultraviolet telescopes, X-ray telescopes, neutrino telescopes and all kinds of other things with which one is seeing objects which were not visible in terms of old-fashioned light.
So many mysteries to be explored. The invisible quasars, which create radio energy stronger than any known on Earth. The pulsars, spinning dead stars that send out rhythmic radio pulses. In the center of a cloud of star debris called the Crab Nebula, a pulsar spins so fast that we hear its pulse 30 times a second. And beyond all imagining, regions of matter and antimatter colliding, spreading waves of energy raging through space. The tool for exploring these things and for searching after life in the universe is radio astronomy, a system impossible before the computer. At Stanford University, Dr. A.R. Thompson.
Since we have 5 antennas, there are 10 ways in which we can combine the signals from them in pairs. We take those 10 combinations of signals, and a computer in our laboratory samples the outputs, and we can combine this data in such a way as to make a map of the sky.
What the radio maps have begun to reveal contradicts the widespread belief that the universe always existed. The radio sources give a picture of the universe not as it is now, but as it was billions of years ago. For the sources are very distant, and it takes that long for the radio waves to reach us. What we see and hear is not what is, but what was. These radio signals show a universe that had more energy billions of years ago than it has now, and still farther back in time was quiet. This may mean that the universe had a birth date, a single explosion about 13 billion years ago. Its matter is still flying apart, but appears to be slowing. Its gravity may one day pull it back toward the center, perhaps to disappear finally into the biggest black hole ever, or to explode again. Before that happens, there are about 80 billion good years left, time enough to make contact with life in many other worlds. To determine how, NASA began a study called Project Cyclops. Its director is Dr. Bernard Oliver.
Within 100 light years of the Earth, there are some 10,000 stars, and about 10% of such stars are thought to be likely candidates for planetary systems that could support life. Out to 1,000 light years, there are some 10 million stars, and again, 10% of these could represent possible candidates. We are contemplating a huge antenna array comprising upwards of 10,000 radio astronomy dishes. These would be interconnected so that their signals would all add together to produce the combined effect of one single large aperture that big. So we're talking about a receiving area that maybe covers dozens of square miles.
There are certainly large odds in favor of there being other inhabited planets, or planets that are inhabited. One thing we don't know is, of course, how long a civilization persists when once it's reached the technological stage in which it would be interested in trying to communicate with other worlds.
If civilizations exist for a substantial length of time, and by that I mean maybe hundreds of thousands or millions or even billion years in an advanced state, then we can certainly say that we are going to be among the more naive of them that can communicate, because we've only been able to do so, if indeed we now can, for something in the order of 10 years.
How long mankind will continue to inhabit this planet and be interested in trying to do in the problem of communicating with other beings, we don't know.
We certainly wouldn't get in touch with anyone that was less advanced.
If civilizations survive their own technology, and if they remain curious, there may indeed be a galactic superculture to search for.
We do have a place ourselves going out into space, and I expect we shall. I expect it will be a major part of the life of the human species, and in the long run, ultimately, small groups of people will be able to roam around the solar system more or less on their own independently. because I believed that, I worked for a year on a nuclear space propulsion system called Orion. And it's a system that uses bombs to propel a ship through space. And it turns out this is much more sensible than it sounds. The bomb explodes outside the ship. The ship has shock absorbers which intercept the debris and convert an explosive impulse into a smooth one.
Men will certainly explore the solar system one way or another. But to meet other intelligent life, we may run against a wall of time. Someday, an astronaut will travel at nearly the speed of light and reach the Andromeda Galaxy, having aged only 28 years thanks to relativity. But his first message home will find an Earth 4 million years older than the one he left. His time will have stretched, but ours will not. There are fewer than 10 promising planetary systems in our galaxy that allow a round trip within a lifetime. If we find life in them, is it intelligent? Yet to reach any farther, we will somehow have to assure that our dreams outlive our societies and weather the storms of history. Or at least, so it all seems now.
Back, I think it was in 1935, Lord Rutherford, who was one of the outstanding nuclear physicists of the day and one of the outstanding physicists of all time, was asked what the chances were that man could exploit the energy that physicists, he, outstandingly, had been able to discover locked in the nucleus of an atom. His answer was nonsense. It will never happen. People who say that are talking pure moonshine.
Not 10 years later, Lord Rutherford's impossible actually took place. This was Stonehenge. Here, a society long forgotten tried to make sense of the universe. The questions are lost with the answers. The people left no record. But their questions were probably like ours, 2,500 years later. These are our monuments to the same curiosity. Huge antennae to hear the voices of the universe. Enormous cyclotrons to explore the nature of matter and find what holds things together. Will ours, too, be a quest in vain?
The question is often raised, what is the use of it all? Why should society invest $250 million in the construction of this machine and $50 million a year to run the laboratory and to do experiments?
It's marvelous that Congress votes the money for it, and I hope they go on voting the money for it. But I wouldn't try to bamboozle the public into thinking that this is really going to have any big payoff for them.
Neither Gell-Mann nor I will claim that we shall find quarks at this machine. He's quite doubtful himself nowadays. If it's not quarks, it may be something else.
Feynman remarked once, if you want to find out how a Swiss watch works, one of the worst ways to find it out is to bang two of them together, which is what we do in the scattering experiments.
The theory is a mess in the sense that there isn't any theory. There are little bits and pieces, cookbook recipes for calculating one thing or another. There isn't any coherent body of ideas that pulls the thing together.
But there certainly are groups of people, one of them is Professor Chu's group at Berkeley, who believe that the present particles are made out of each other, so-called bootstrap hypothesis, and that we are at the end. That theory is not in an any more convincing state than the others, I think.
Maybe we are too cautious not building bigger devices. Right now, I think we are sort of wasting our time with this.
Perhaps there is a galactic superculture that we may be eligible to become members of.
Perhaps. But first, there's one basic puzzle to be solved. Long before men dreamed of atoms or discovered the nucleus, they wanted to understand what matter really is, what holds it together, why doesn't it fly apart? 40 years ago, this early cyclotron was built by physicists in Berkeley. It had an acceleration ring 10 feet around, and its purpose was to learn what holds the nucleus of an atom together. The latest cyclotron covers more than a square mile of farmland in northern Illinois. Its ring is 4 miles around. It makes a beam of electrical particles 2,000 times stronger than the biggest lightning bolt. There have been many accelerators between these two, each bigger than the last. Each failed to discover what holds the nucleus of atoms together. What they have revealed is that instead of a few basic particles in the atom, there are hundreds of particles in bewildering variety. But whatever holds the core of an atom together against its own explosive force is still nature's most precious and closely held secret. Physicists call it the strong force, and they can tap a little of it in a bomb or a nuclear power plant, but they don't understand it. And why are there so many particles? They yearn for a simpler picture. They may be getting close. At the controls in Illinois, Dr. Edwin Goldwasser.
We are now in the control room of the latest in the long line of these accelerators, which really you can describe as microscopes. We'll be looking at the smallest structures that have ever yet been attainable to man, because our energy is higher. With these particle accelerators, the energy is analogous to the magnification of a microscope. The higher the energy we have, the smaller the objects we can look at.
The purpose of these huge voltage generators is to subject matter to the kind of energy that created the universe. What happens then is something we have never seen, although Albert Einstein predicted it in 1905. In the accelerators, particles of atoms are pushed to nearly the speed of light, the maximum in nature. Then an astonishing thing happens. As yet more energy is pumped into the particles, they put on weight. Pure energy somehow turns into matter. Stranger yet, at this speed, time slows. In the most literal sense, accelerators are time machines. If a physicist could ride an electron through the 2-mile accelerator at Stanford, we would hear the effects of relativity, the stretching of time, like this.
Energy is transferred from the electromagnetic field inside the guide to the electrons. They accelerate to about the speed of light, and after that, the increases in the energy or the momentum of the particles and not in their speed.
The accelerator is 2 miles long. It has 240 high-powered Klystron tubes. The machine is poised on for the moon.
The voice would slow because in the accelerator time is stretched for a particle speeding toward its target. The pieces flying from its collision with the target are photographed as they streak through a liquid. In thousands of photographs, physicists search for clues. What happens to matter when its tremendous binding force is broken down by collision? And what is that force? Through these photographs, we may finally learn the answers. The machinery is immense and costly. It is a clumsy way, but we have no other. And it is beginning to work. We can break into the atom, even into the nucleus. Now we want to break into the infinitesimal proton itself, 100,000 times smaller than the atom. In the 30s, physicists thought the proton was basic. Now they think it has something else inside. And that tiny something may be our answer.
We may find a new simplicity. We might, for example, find another new particle, which is the last thing we need at this stage of our work. On the other hand, we may find one that has been proposed which would exist in a threesome. These particles have been named quarks by Professor Gell-Mann, who created the idea. In his scheme, from these 3 quarks, it is possible to construct not only neutrons and protons, which we have known for a long time, but also all these other hundreds of particles that we've discovered in the intervening decades.
The experimental physicists place their hope in instruments. Theoretical physicists place their hope in the mind. At the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, Professor Dyson.
At the moment, the experiments are beautiful, but the theory is just a mess. And it's questionable whether doing more and more of these beautiful experiments is really going to help matters for us theorists. What has been unusual is that physics did have a very beautiful theory which worked extremely well and explained almost everything until about the last 20 years. There will certainly be ultimately a new and much more comprehensive theory. What we don't know is how close we are to it. The thing that bothers physicists, particularly somebody like me who's just sitting here in Einstein's office, is that in some way we don't feel very adequate. I mean, we are obviously not as deep and as philosophical as he was, and whether that bothers you or not, of course, is a matter of temperament. Einstein had this extraordinary feeling for the deeper meaning of ideas. Somehow he never needed to look at details very much. I mean, his discovery of relativity came from pure thinking, really from nothing more than just a general knowledge of the theory of electromagnetism and a feeling for the basic realities of the universe, which somehow he had. At the present time, physics seems to be in an unphilosophical phase, and this already was true in the last 20 years of Einstein's life. In some way, he was not any longer, at the end of his life, in the mainstream of things. He was out of sympathy with a great deal that the younger people were doing. His own philosophical way of looking at physics just didn't seem to be the way to go to the younger people. One of the characteristic features of the whole of modern physics in the post-Einstein era is that it depends on counting experiments, that everything we do, even in astronomy, is basically a matter of counting particles. We count photons. If your view of the universe is based on this kind of a counting experiment, there's no way in which you can look at things in the way that Einstein did, as entirely a continuous process. In some sense, there is a basic chance involved in whether a photon hits your detector at a particular moment or not. Now, this element of chance in the universe seems to be very basic when we don't understand how one could even think about it in any other terms at the moment. But for Einstein, it was an anathema. He just wouldn't accept it. And he said God does not play dice, and that was it as far as he was concerned. Well, we just happen to believe that he does.
This series, The Shock of the New, is about an old subject, almost 100 years old, the art of our own century, modernism. The key word of the new century was modernity. Modernity meant believing in technology and not craft, in human perfectibility, not original sin, and above all, in a ceaseless consumption of things and the images of things. If you were a Parisian alive in 1890 and you wanted to show a visitor what modernity meant, you pointed to this structure, the tallest man-made object on Earth, the Tower of Babel of the new machine age. Since the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, the big powers of Europe had taken to holding world's fairs to show off their industrial strength. Paris scheduled one for 1889, the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. This was its emblem, a huge act of propaganda designed not by an architect, but by an engineer, Gustave Eiffel. The tower was the static totem of the cult of dynamism, a colossus planted with spread legs in the middle of Paris. Its shape alluded to the human body and to the colossi of the past. It was the guardian of the future. It summed up what technological progress meant to the men who ran Europe at the end of the 19th century, the promise of unlimited control over the world and its wealth. The most visible sign of the future was the automobile, and this is the first public sculpture ever set up in its praise. It commemorates the great road race of 1895 from Paris to Bordeaux and back, which was won by an engineer named Émile Levasseur in the car that he designed and built himself, the Ponhard Levasseur 5. It could do about the same speed as a jumping frog, but not very much more. Nevertheless, Levasseur's victory was of tremendous social consequence because it persuaded Europeans, both manufacturers and public alike, that the future of road transport lay with the internal combustion engine and not, as many had thought before, with either electricity or steam. In all justice, there ought to be a replica of this thing set up in every oil port from the Persian Gulf to Houston. But if it looks somewhat ludicrous to us as sculpture today, that's because of difficulties between sculpture and the new convention of the machine. A stone car. The idea seems surrealist to a modern eye. It's simply incongruous. Stone is immobile, mineral, brittle, cold. Cars are fast, metallic, elastic, warm. A human body is warm too, but we don't think of statues as stone men because we're used to the conventions of representing flesh with stone. There were no such conventions for depicting machinery. It was too new. But the conditions of seeing were also starting to change, and the Eiffel Tower stood for that too. What counted was not so much the view of the tower from the ground. It was seeing the ground from the tower. Nobody except a few men in balloons had ever seen this before. There were individual pilots who saw the sight from their planes, but it was the Eiffel Tower that gave a mass audience a chance to see what you and I take for granted every time we fly. The earth on which we live seen flat as pattern from above. The Eiffel Tower was therefore a pivot in human consciousness, and that view of the city seen by those hundreds of thousands of visitors was as significant in 1889 as the sight of the earth from the moon would be 80 years later. Through the medium of technology, culture was reinventing itself everywhere. In 1877, Thomas Alva Edison came up with the most radical extension of cultural memory since the printed book. He invented sound recording, the first human utterance ever retrieved.
I designed my original tin-foil phonograph in cylinder form and gave it to my faithful John Crucy to make. He made fun of it. I was almost as surprised as he was when the first model introduced Mary How the Little Lamb, which had shouted into it.
The place was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
In 1879, Edison invented the incandescent filament bulb. The fairy electricity was now let loose upon the world, thus amazing people who had up to now depended upon gas and whale oil to see at night. In 1895, the Lumiere brothers made the images of a magic lantern move. They invented the movie camera and the projector. In 1898, Marie Curie discovered radium. In 1901, Guglielmo Marconi sent the first transatlantic radio message along the Virgin airwaves from Cornwall to the east coast of America. In 1903, two home inventors, Wilbur and Orville Wright, observed the wind, put wings on a bicycle, scrambled into it, started their motor, and to the stupefaction of the world, took off, achieving man's first powered flight in a heavier-than-air machine. In 1905, an obscure physicist named Albert Einstein developed the special theory of relativity, the basis of the largest change in man's view of the universe since Isaac Newton. He ushered in the nuclear age with one formula.
E is equal mc squared, in which energy is per equal to mass multiplied with the square of the velocity of light, showed that very small amount of mass may be converted into a very large amount of energy.
Very few people understood it, and nobody could foresee its implications. By 1913, Henry Ford had so developed the idea of mass production that the car, running on Mr. Dunlop's pneumatic tyres, ceased to be a toy for the rich and became every man's chariot. The Wright brothers had only got a few yards off the ground, but within 6 years, a French aviator named Louis Blériot managed to pilot his buzzing wooden dragonfly from one country to another, from France to England, across the vast cultural divide of the English Channel. In 1913, the French writer Charles Péguy remarked,
"The world has changed less since the time of Jesus Christ than it has in the last 30 years.
He was right, and it was a widespread feeling. For the essence of the early modernist experience was not the specific inventions. Most people weren't affected by a prototype in a lab or an equation on a blackboard. Not yet. No, the important thing was the sense of an accelerated rate of change in all areas of human discourse. It provided the feeling of an approaching millennium, a new order of things, as the 19th century clicked over into the 20th, the end of one kind of history and the start of another.
Soon after Blériot flew the Channel, his little monoplane was carried in public procession through the streets of Paris and installed in a church, for all the world like the relic of an archangel. And such was the early apotheosis of the machine. But to have a cult does not mean that the images automatically follow. The changes in man's view of himself and the world between 1880 and 1914 were so far-reaching that they produced as many problems for artists as they did stimuli. For instance, how could you make paintings that would reflect the immense shifts in consciousness that this changed technological landscape implied? How could you produce a parallel dynamism to the machine age without falling into the elementary trap of just becoming a machine illustrator? And above all, how? By shoving around on a canvas sticky stuff like paint on a static surface, could you produce a convincing record of process and transformation? Now, the first artists to come up with a sketch for an answer to this were the Cubists.
Since the Renaissance, almost all painting had obeyed a convention. It was that of one-point perspective. Perspective was a geometrical means for producing an illusion of reality, for showing things in space in their right sizes and positions. Nevertheless, it was an abstraction. It was a view seen by a motionless, one-eyed person, clearly detached from what he sees. Perspective gathers the visual facts, and it stabilizes them. It makes a god of the spectator, who becomes the person on whom the whole world converges, the unmoved onlooker. Cubism argued that reality includes the painter's efforts to perceive it. Both the viewer and the view are part of the same field. The first artist to explore this idea and finally to base his work on it was Paul Cézanne. The question of why the paintings that Cézanne made in his old age were to have such a vast effect upon the history of art can't be answered in terms of style. What they proposed was more radical than style. It was a fundamental argument about the way that we actually see. He wants to show the process of seeing, not just the results. And he takes you through this process. You share his hesitations about the position of a trunk or a branch, or the final shape of a mountain and the trees in front of it. The statement, "This is what I see," becomes replaced by a question, "Is this what I see?" Relativity is all. The idea that doubt can be heroic if it is locked into a structure as grand as the paintings of Cézanne's old age, that is one of the keys of our century and a touchstone of modernism itself. Cubism would bring it to an extreme. The idea began here at 13 Rue Ravignan in Paris in 1907 in a warren of cheap artists' studios called the Bateau Lavoir, or laundry boat. It was set off by a Spaniard, Pablo Picasso, then aged 26. Picasso's partner in inventing Cubism was a slightly younger and rather more conservative Frenchman, Georges Braque. In the public eye, these men didn't exist. The audience for their paintings might have been a dozen people, and this meant that they were free, as researchers in some very obscure area of science are free. Nobody cared enough to interfere. They wanted to paint the fact that our knowledge of an object is made up of all possible views of it, top, sides, front, back. They wanted to compress this inspection, which takes time, into one moment, one synthesized view. One of their experimental materials was the art of other cultures, oceanic and African, as despised as they then were. At the time, there were no museums of tribal art like this one to consult.
One of the mild ironies of Cubism is the extent to which it was helped by the French Empire in Africa. Picasso and Braque both owned African carvings, but they had no anthropological interest in them at all. They didn't care about their ritual uses, they knew nothing about their original tribal meanings, or about the societies out of which they came. They simply used them formally, and in that regard, Cubism was like a small parody of the imperial model. The masks were simply raw material from the darkest Congo, like copper or palm oil, and Picasso's use of them was in effect a kind of cultural plunder. But then why use African art at all? The Cubists were just about the first artists to even think of doing so. 130 years before, when Benjamin West admired the cloths and the clubs and the carvings that had come back from the Pacific with Captain Cook, no Royal Academicians then took the cue and started painting Tahitian style. When Picasso started to produce what was in effect white art in blackface, he was saying what no 18th century painter would ever have imagined himself saying. He was proposing that the tradition of the human figure, which had served Western art so well over the preceding centuries, had at last run out, and that in order to renew its vitality, you had to look elsewhere, in effect to look to those folks in Africa with rhythm. This was not so much a gesture of homage in the direction of the blacks, though, as it was a successful raid on them by the whites.
What Picasso did care about was the formal vitality of the carvings, the freedom to distort. And something else. They were, to him, in the most literal sense, emblems of savagery, of violence transferred into the sphere of culture. But this did produce the painting whose shock value provoked Cubism, and this was Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. No painting ever looked more convulsive, and none signalled a faster change in the history of art. And yet, it was anchored in the tradition of the new. Picasso began it the year Cézanne died, and its nearest ancestor was Cézanne's bathers. It also descends from Picasso's Spanish heritage. Those unstable, twisting bodies are like El Greco, and so is the angular, harshly lit space. The 5 nudes are chopped into planes and arcs as though the brush were a butcher knife. Their mass is breaking up, and even today you think of dismemberment. Even the melon looks like a weapon. The space is flattened like a squashed box, as solid as the figures. And in the midst of all this violent abstraction, the masks. The 3 on the left are derived from archaic Spanish sculpture. The 2 on the right from African carvings. All of them staring with the hypnotic fixity that Picasso would always give to the eye. Picasso never liked the title. He called his painting the Avignon Brothel because there had been a whorehouse on the Carrer d'Avignon, or Avignon Street, in Barcelona when he was a student. His original idea was to paint an allegory of venereal disease called The Wages of Sin. A man carousing in a brothel and another man coming in at the left with what was going to be a skull, that very Spanish reminder of mortality. In the final painting, though, only the nudes are left, archaic and aggressive, and their cult is the fear of women. No painter ever put his anxiety about castration more plainly than Picasso did here, and the combination of form and subject was alarming to the few people who saw Les Demoiselles. Georges Braque was horrified by its ugliness and intensity, but he painted a relatively timid and laborious response to it, and from then on, Braque and Picasso would be locked in a partnership of questions and responses, roped together like mountaineers, as Braque memorably said. Picasso cleared the ground for Cubism, but it was Georges Braque who, over the next 2 years, 1908 and 1909, did the most to develop its vocabulary. They say the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Now, Picasso was the fox. He was the virtuoso. Braque was the hedgehog, and the one big thing that he knew was Cézanne, with whom he identified to the point of obsession. He admired Cézanne, as he put it, for sweeping painting clear of the idea of mastery. He loved his doubt, his doggedness, his concentration, his lack of eloquence. Well, Braque wanted to see if Cézanne's way of building a painting, that fusing of little tilted facets, that solidity of structure and ambiguity of reading, could be pushed further, which he did with the landscapes he painted in 2 places where Cézanne himself had worked. First at L'Estaque in the south of France in 1908. The Estaque paintings began as almost straight Cézanne. This is one view that Braque looked at that summer. This is what he made of it. Every scrap of detail edited out, prisms, triangles. Yet the shading no longer gives you a feeling of solidity. Some of the corners could either be sticking out of the picture or pointing back into it. In the summer of 1909, Braque went painting closer to Paris in a village in the Seine Valley called La Roche-Guyon. The valley's lined with chalk cliffs, and there's a castle built into them. It belongs to the La Rochefoucauld family, and Braque made it his motif, that jumble of plains and gables and spires stacked up against the cliff. Moreover, on the top there's a 13th century Norman tower, and it was in ruins when Braque saw it, as it is today, but it gave him another part of his motif, a big strong cylinder on top. So there was this, from his point of view, nice rhyme between the actual forms of the landscape and the shapes that he wanted to put in a painting. Between those plains ascending the cliff, going in and out, pressed forward by the cliff itself, which blocked off the perspective. This was what he painted. He then scrambled up the chalk bluff to the side and looked at the castle from an angle which gave him an even more complicated geometry of gables and turrets coming down into the town. So would Braque have invented Cubism on his own? Probably, but it would have lacked the power that Picasso brought to it. This was his unequaled ability to realize form, to make you feel the shape and the weight and the silence of things. This is the plastic power of a sculptor, but in paint. And distorted as they are, you're made to feel them so strongly that you can imagine them picked off the canvas in 3 dimensions. For the moment, Picasso's portraits, like this one of the dealer Vollard, were still recognizable, but any reality was bound to alter once it was thrust into the shifting, abstract space that he and Braque had invented. By 1911, Picasso and Braque were painting like Siamese twins. This painting of a guitarist is by Braque. This one, of another guitarist, is by Picasso. Their paintings of this period are virtually indistinguishable except for fine differences of handwriting. Without the labels on the gallery wall, you could hardly guess which painting is by which of the 2 painters. All this break-up and shuffling. Nobody had ever painted more baffling images. Nothing is constant. Every shape is a report on multiple meanings. It's an attempt to set out the world as a field of shifting relationships that include the onlooker. They were trying to paint process. Braque and Picasso were not mathematicians, and certainly they weren't philosophers, but their art was part of the same great tide of modernist thought that included Einstein and the philosopher Alfred Whitehead.
The misconception which has haunted philosophic literature throughout the centuries is the notion of independent existence. There is no such mode of existence. Every entity is only to be understood in terms of the way in which it is interwoven with the rest of the universe.
As Gertrude Stein remembered it, the Cubist game of hide and seek with reality fed back into the world in odd ways.
The first year of the war, Picasso and myself were walking down the Boulevard Raspail. All of a sudden, down the street came some big cannon. The first any of us had seen painted, that is, camouflaged. Pablo stopped. He was spellbound. "C'est nous qui avons fait ça," he said. "It is we that have created that." And he was right. He had.
Camouflage was Cubism at war. And ever since, the Cubists' delight in ambiguity, what is seen and not seen, has had its ominously practical uses.
What's this? Comic book collector host Frank Gorshin held hostage by the evil Neville?
Now that I've captured you, you'll never make it to the taping of Comic Book Collector. But I gotta! Now that I've stopped you, no one will learn about comic books. They'll all be mine. If there was only some way.
Thank goodness, young John Crane is reading of Frank's predicament. With a whisk and a whisk, he transforms himself and plunges into the story to become...
Oh no, Captain Comic.
You're finished, Neville. When will you learn that comics are for everyone?
You can't do this to me.
With the evil Neville stopped, Captain Comic whisks Frank to the taping of Comic Book Collector.
Hi, I'm Frank Gorshin. This is Comic Book Collector. You know, comic book collecting today is perhaps the most exciting hobby around. That's right. At one time, comic books were thought of as kid stuff, but today the comic book has grown up. Certainly Hollywood has always seen the comic book superhero as a big box office attraction, from the 1930 movie serials to the blockbuster mega hits of Batman, Superman, Dick Tracy. People flock to see their heroes on the big screen. And each week, TV viewers tune into Superman, Wonder Woman, and of course Batman, where yours truly got a chance to portray his arch-villain, the Riddler. It's obvious the comic book format has entertained readers and audiences for more than 60 years. Along with baseball and jazz, the comic book is truly Americana. So where did it all begin? The year was 1897. McKinley was in the White House. The diesel engine was invented, and William Randolph Hearst's New York American newspaper published Richard Outcault's The Yellow Kid for the first time. This hardcover collection of reprints of Outcault's 1896 comic strips, which appeared in the New York World newspaper, is recognized as the earliest comic book. From 1899 to 1917, over 70 hardcover books containing reprints of popular Sunday newspaper comic strips were published. Popular strips such as Buster Brown, Foxy Grandpa, Katzenjammer Kids, Little Nemo, Mutt and Jeff, Barney Google, Joe Palooka, and Little Orphan Annie made up these collections. In 1917, the Saulfield Publishing Company was the first to use the term comic book. The book featured reprints of Clancy the Cop strips, and it actually entitled itself Comic Book. In 1922, MB Publishing issued the first monthly comic which featured one strip per issue. It was called Comic Monthly. 7 years later, George Delacorte of Dell Publishing produced the first comic books that featured original strips. The first of these, entitled The Funnies, failed to gain acceptance. One of the main reasons may have been that the comic books sold in traditional newspaper size, and the public felt as though they were buying an incomplete newspaper. Also available at the time was The Big Little Book, published by Whitman Publishing Company. The first issue contained The Adventures of Dick Tracy. The books were 300 to 400 pages in length. In 1933, an idea struck Eastern Color Printing Company of Waterbury, Connecticut. This idea was to revolutionize the comic book. The printers at Eastern Color had done some experimenting and found that they could reduce the size of a comic book to 8 by 11 inches by taking a newspaper funny section and laying it horizontally so the strips were side by side. With this new method of printing comic books, Eastern executive Harry Wildenberg obtained newspaper reprints of strips such as Mutt and Jeff, Hairbreadth Harry, and Joe Palooka as contents for his new comics. His idea was to convince manufacturers to give them away as premiums. This method of advertising had been very successful throughout the previous decades with the tobacco company's use of baseball cards as premiums. Comic book salesman extraordinaire Max C. Gaines sold 10,000 comic books to Procter & Gamble, who in turn issued them as coupon giveaways. This first modern comic was called Funnies on Parade. With the realization that comic books were a hit, Eastern Color and Dell Publishing issued the first comic book that retailed to the public on newsstands. The first of these was Famous Funnies Series 1. It sold for 10 cents and remained a popular comic book for years to come. The 10-cent cover price remained the standard for the next 25 years.
Well, look, Pilgrim's up in the sky. It's a bird.
Oh, wait a second. If my memory serves me correctly, I believe that's a plane.
Wait a second, you're both wrong. I want to tell you, that's my pal, Superman, eh? Maybe now I'll get some respect. How do you like that? A bird or a plane? That's Superman. What do you say, pal?
Superman debuted in Action Comics #1. It was written by Jerry Siegel and drawn by Joe Shuster. The Man of Steel's appearance on the cover truly ignited what's referred to as the golden age of comics. No other comic book has been more important than this one, and certainly no other superhero has been more imitated or inspiring than Superman. A year later, DC's Detective Comics #27 debuted The Batman. It was written by Bill Finger and illustrated by Bob Kane. Well, one of these 1939 comic books in mint condition just recently sold for $135,000. Kane, a young illustrator working for DC, was inspired by the success of the Superman character. At the time, Kane was earning $35 a week, while at the same time Siegel and Shuster were earning $800 apiece for their work on Superman. As legend has it, Kane worked up the Batman character over a weekend. Influenced by Da Vinci's Flying Machine and the film The Bat Whispers, Kane created the original Batman. Although Superman and Batman shared a huge financial success, their personalities as superheroes were as different as day and night. Superman and Batman weren't the only attractions in their comic books. The villains, sidekicks, and spin-offs were as popular with readers as the superheroes themselves.
That's right. Wait till you get a load of this.
In 1964, a gentleman had nothing to do with a long airplane flight, so he picked up a copy of Batman and was hooked. His name, William Dozier, the eventual producer and narrator of the 1966 Batman TV series. By 1940, the original comic books surpassed the Sunday reprints in newsstand sales. Publishers like Fawcett, Centaur, Fox Features, and Harry A. Chesler syndicates, among others, began introducing titles featuring science fiction, fantasy, war, and animals. It was evident that the comic book market was booming and readers were embracing these new characters as well as the new and exciting superheroes. Max C. Gaines left DC Comics in 1945 and opened up his own company, EC, which began an unsuccessful run of comic books entitled Picture Stories from the Bible and Stories from American History. At the time, EC stood for Educational Comics, which by 1947 was changed to Entertaining Comics by Max C. Gaines' son, William, who was now running the show.
When I was a kid, I read science fiction pulps and horror pulps, and they were my favorite reading. So basically, I was putting into comic books the same kind of stuff that I had read as a kid. And since no one had done quite the same thing in comics before, although it was old stuff in pulps, my comics were unique for a while, so everybody imitated them. We had a tremendously talented staff. The stories were good. The artists were the best in the field. And we just put out very good comics.
Today, many collectors agree that William Gaines's EC Comics are the finest examples of the comic book form. With dramatic illustrations, provocative storylines and titles, and cutting-edge humor, EC's unparalleled standards attracted all the top artists. Archie Comics was originally known as MLJ Magazine. The initials came from its founders, Morris Coyne, Louis Cybercleet, and John Goldwaters. Established in 1939 with the help from syndicator Harry A. Chesler, they published the first line of comic books. One of the earliest titles was called Pep. And, as Victor Garlick tells us, Archie is still alive and well in Riverdale, USA.
John Goldwater he was one of the founders of the company, and he had this idea for a teenage character, and he had his artist who was working in the art department at the time. He had a few artists working there, and he had them all do likenesses of what he thought this teenage character should look like, and Bob Montana was the first artist to do the likeness of Archie. And so they put the first story of Archie and Pep, and it really took off. There was a very big response to it. It was during the war, and there was a lot of attention drawn to it because it was that tie-in with home and, a lot of soldiers being away overseas and the whole family unit. And so Archie became very popular. They published the first book in '42, and the rest is history. He was not a superhero, and he was very believable, and that's why Archie's still popular today. He's always remained contemporary with the times, and it's not like he's stood still. I mean, you read Archie stories now, they're certainly a lot different than they were back in the 40s. Quite recently, we added quite a few new titles to the list. One of our most successful ones being Veronica, the Veronica title, and in each issue she travels to a different place. The first one she traveled was Veronica in Paris, and Veronica in Germany, Veronica in Mexico. Now we are working on an issue now where Veronica goes to Russia.
In 1954, Dr. Frederick Wortham published a book called The Seduction of the Innocent. This book cited comic books as a direct link to juvenile delinquency. The book created such an uproar that a Senate subcommittee was formed to investigate the allegations.
He was a psychiatrist who did believe that comics caused juvenile delinquency. He made a good living believing this for a long time, testifying at different trials of kids that got in trouble and saying they got in trouble because they read comics. The subcommittee was attempting to blame comics for juvenile delinquency on the theory that every juvenile delinquent had read comics. They had also eaten ice cream, but somehow that didn't mean anything.
In order to avoid further government intervention, comic book publishers created the Comic Code Authority to maintain their own standards. The reissue of DC's The Flash, a 1940s superhero, is cited as launching what is referred to as the Silver Age. Perhaps the best-known name associated with comic books, besides the superheroes themselves, is Marvel publisher Stan Lee. He started writing for Marvel in the 1940s, and by the 1960s, Stan Lee had brought Marvel to the forefront of the comic book world. With the debut of the Fantastic Four, Marvel quickly had the hottest-selling comic book of the 60s. Marvel's working artists Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, along with Stan Lee, created some of the most dynamic superheroes that are as popular today as when they debuted. Everybody knows Jerry Lewis, Lucille Ball, and the Three Stooges from the world of Hollywood. But did you know they all have appeared in comic books?
From a loaded gun.
In the 1980s, the newsstand was no longer the dominant place to purchase comics. Comic book publishers began to recognize the collector's market and the significance of the comic book store. With collectors turning to their comic book shop to buy new issues, a new trend appeared. The independent comic book boom took hold. Though not polished in design, these mostly black and white issues dealt with strong subject matters and outrageous characters. This new breed of radical comics was reminiscent of the underground comics of the 60s. Many independents ignored the comic code, and it seemed as if everyone was publishing a comic book. The major comic publishers had taken notice of the more graphic comic books and their popularity. Incorporating this new art form and satisfying the collector's thirst for more mature subject matter, the graphic novel evolved. Certainly, comic books had changed. Characters were experiencing more personal problems, and their vulnerabilities were exposed as they became more believable to the reader. The advent of the graphic novel allowed the subject matter and the characters to be explored to their limits. The most influential of the graphic novels are The Dark Knight by Frank Miller, which was an inspiration for the movie Batman, DC's Watchmen, Arkham Asylum, as well as Faust and Stray Toasters. Naturally, the price tags on these graphic novels are considerably higher than the standard comic book due to the superior quality of the illustrations, printing process, and paper stock. Graphic novels often stray from the classic comic book format. Panels are arranged in unconventional layouts. Characters and storylines often appear in abstract form. Such is the case with Art Spiegelman's highly acclaimed Mouse.
It's about what happened to my father and mother, which is they were Jews in Eastern Europe during the Hitler years, and they got caught up in the entire maelstrom, including the concentration camps. It's in the form of a comic book, in the form of my father relating to me what happened to him and my mother, and the characters in the book are portrayed with animal heads. It's a comic book for adults.
Many of today's illustrators are learning the craft at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Comic book illustrating is taught by some of the greatest comic book artists of all time there. Eisner, Kirby, and DC's Joe Orlando among SVA's faculty.
I think drawing can be learned. Learned as much, as easily as you learn how to write. People who say I can't draw a straight line, right on track, they shouldn't be drawing straight lines. Given the necessary essentials, most people can learn how to draw.
One of the most important things about being a collector is knowing how to take care of your comics. Comic book paper contains acid, which is a residual effect of the manufacturing process. This accelerates the aging process. Although you can't stop the aging process, here are some products that help slow it down. You've probably seen comic books in plastic bags at comic stores and conventions. These sleeves are especially designed for comic book storage. Two of the most popular are polypropylene and Mylar bags manufactured by DuPont. You should get into the habit of changing the sleeves every 2 to 3 years for maximum protection. It's also a good idea to use acid-free backing boards. These prevent your comics from creasing and bending while in storage. Collectors should keep their collections in storage boxes. Boxes free of acid are also available to collectors. By following these steps, you can assure yourself a long-lasting collection. You all know Captain America, the Incredible Hulk, and the Mighty Thor, but 1967 Marvel's Nut Brand Ek #3 showed them in a slightly different way, for it was now Charlie America, the Incredible Bulk, and the Mighty Thor fighting crime. The condition of a comic book is vitally important in determining its value. The following is a list to help you determine the various conditions. The Comic Buyer's Guide is published weekly by Krause Publications of Iola, Wisconsin. It'll help you find out the value of comic books, how to buy and sell by mail, and what you need to know to keep abreast of everything happening in the hobby. You'll be able to find the latest issue at your local comic book store. Along with Krause, there are other comic book guides and catalogs that range in subject and can satisfy the beginner or advanced collector. Krause also publishes a price guide, and along with Overstreet's official comic book price guide, you'll be able to determine the value of every comic book ever made. Comics are listed by year and title and are priced according to its condition. But remember, if you're selling your comic books, expect dealers to offer a lower price than listed. One of the best places to browse around and buy new and old comics is your local comic book store. Comic stores afford collectors a chance to develop a one-on-one relationship with the dealer.
Comics are no longer for kids. It's taken a tremendous turn for adults. It's a little more explicit, it's more graphic, and it's, as I say, far more adult. The themes are adult, so that you don't get the average kid who comes in here to buy a comic book.
We've had an influx of tremendous publicity from the movies, from the entertainment world, from the Superman movies, obviously. I mean, it's nonsensical to even mention the Batman movie. That's going to be at least 3 to 5 movies. You know, what you got going on there is a tremendous influx of that. So you have people coming in the store who would never dream of buying a comic book. Just as I want Batman. And the other thing is it has become an investment item, which has drawn in a tremendous amount of new people into the field. That in turn has caused comic prices to rise because comics that you put to sell 20 years ago, you can't find today.
Parents buy comics for their kids, parents buy comics for themselves. We have lawyers, we have doctors who look at it as an investment. Comics can increase in value very quickly, and people want to capitalize on that. It's like stocks. They want to get in. They want to get the popular titles. They want to ask me what's going to go up next month, what's going to be of value, and that's what we do. We try to guide the people who are into it for investor into the books that are going to increase in value. But then there's a whole other realm of the hardcore fan who's been buying for 20 years or 15 years, and they love the stories, they love the art. And it's like it's a marriage between the two types of collectors.
Well, there's so many comics to collect. I would say the first thing is find something you like. Find something you really appreciate. More than the intrinsic value, the monetary value of a comic, the personal value is a lot of it. I mean, I couldn't collect every single comic in the world, but there are a few titles that I collect religiously. I'd say find a comic that you really like. Make it not something that you couldn't collect everything of. Make it a feasible goal, and start collecting back issues. Collect all the current issues, of course, but see if you can get a whole series together.
This is a place you can come to all the time. The schedule of new books is pretty consistent. In fact, the schedule of any particular book is fairly consistent, especially from the major companies. And this will allow you, the amount of copies that a store will carry will usually allow you to be sure you get a copy. And many stores offer a subscription service, whereas you can give them a list of the books that you collect, and they will pull them for you. So you can come in 3, 4, 5 days later.
How do you start to collect anything? All right? You develop an interest in it, and then you want to pursue the interest.
All across the country, collectors also look forward to weekend conventions. Collectors can find almost every comic ever made at these cons. You'll find that dealers specialize in certain categories of comics. You usually get your best buys at these shows, but remember to shop around because many dealers carry the same stock and prices may vary. At these shows, you'll also have a chance to meet some of the top illustrators and publishers and celebrities who've portrayed comic book characters.
We're long-time readers of comics, and we enjoy the work that the professionals in the field are doing, and this is a chance really for fans of comics and readers to get together with each other and also to meet some of their favorites, and that's the idea behind the convention. It's a social event, also a business event in a certain sense, but more or less for everyone to get together and celebrate their love of comics, and we've been doing this for many years, and as fans ourselves, it's really a pleasure to see all the people turn out to enjoy the show with us.
Well, thanks for looking and listening. For the Comic Book Collector, I'm Frank Gorshin. Also available in the Collector's Series, Baseball Card Collector, hosted by Mel Allen.